Previously on Psychosocialism.
This is speculation on my part, but I think that deep-rooted fear of facing yourself in the mirror and seeing flaws in what you find is why this transphobic and baseless fear-mongering has spread as far as it has. And as long as trans youth are feared and talked over rather than accepted and respected as individuals, this kind of shit will sadly keep happening.
Well, looks like it's still happening.
Make some noise, London Trans Pride!
One of the annoying things about being openly in favour of trans rights is that your Twitter mentions get filled to the brim with idiots throwing science arguments at you. Whether it be irrelevant biology Punnett squares they vaguely remember from high school, or articles from scientifically illiterate journalists commenting on a study they either didn't read or didn't understand. One of the favourite narratives pushed by this varying collection of idiots is the "what about all these people who transition and later regret it?" And on the surface, it seems like a fair question, right? Detransitioners do exist. It's a tiny minority of a tiny minority, but they do exist and I'm not here to deny that. If someone decides to take steps along the long path of transition, then changes their mind and stops, that is their choice to make, based on their experience of their life and their identity. I wish every one of them a life full of happiness and free of dysphoria and discrimination. A group of people who don't wish that, of course, is the TERF community, who are quite happy to use detransitioners as a stick to beat trans people with, but speak over the groups as a whole in the media. TERFs are just kinda shitty people for the most part.
It's the surprise, surprise. The unexpected hits you between the eyes.
Their disdain for detransitioned people and willingness to use them for political gain is reflected in the scientific arguments they throw at you during Twitter fights. The rapid onset gender dysphoria argument is based on the idea that teenagers, especially those who are assigned female at birth, are only transitioning because of social media, the millennials, something kids these days always on their phones, teenage girls, am I right? Rapid onset gender dysphoria is of course a made-up diagnosis based on a bullshit study that I debunked pretty thoroughly in a previous video. Unfortunately, despite owning it epically on the internet with 180 IQ facts and epic 420 hype logic, ROGD continues to be discussed inside these transphobic communities as if it was real and the science behind it was more accurate than reading the future through smears of shit on a piece of used toilet paper. Thinly disguised hate organisations like GenSpec with a suspicious amount of money to burn,
from far-right religious groups if the EPF report is to be believed,
have even started to hold conferences around this idea of ROGD, to add a veneer of legitimacy to science that would rightly get you laughed out of a high school science fair. The goal of this is an attempt to delegitimize the scientific consensus around trans people by signal boosting the one study that appears to contradict it, even though that's A, not how scientific consensus works, and B, they got nothing to answer to the slew of data that points in the opposite direction. It's the same thing they do with systemic racism in works like the Bell Curve, or with climate change in, well, the US legislative system.
About global climate change. I mean, it's an accepted scientific phenomenon pretty much everywhere. It's accepted pretty much everywhere, but there's one place. The United States House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology.
It's an old conservative tactic used to convince people who aren't paying attention that a topic is up for debate, when the scientific community has largely concluded its research and agrees with one side rather than the other.
It should be possible to have a discussion where there are a range of different people with a range of different truths who can enter into a dialogue about this.
Unfortunately, it's rather an effective tactic. Lisa Littman, the not psychologist whose shit-awful "Oh God, my eyes" paper started this whole line of attack, has recently come out with another paper that she claims proves ROGD correct, and proves that people detransition because they were convinced they were trans in the first place by social contagion. Detransition research is pretty thin on the ground as it is, at least in the public mind, because the phenomenon itself is relatively rare. Lisa Littman was clearly attempting to capitalise on this perceived gap in the research, trying to become a big fish in a tiny, tiny pond. She's used this, and the idea that her science is getting her cancelled. Oh no, so brave fighting SJW censorship.
What's now known as rapid onset gender dysphoria is a term she coined. It's controversial, and it appears, at least based on the research that she has done, and now some others have taken a look at, as a very real phenomenon, though you'd be hard-pressed to find people within the medical community to support that.
To go on shows like Megyn Kelly, who has a show, apparently, and speak at these well-funded hate orgs to promote her findings as the truth they don't want you to see.
As you can imagine, Dr. Littman immediately came under attack. Trans activists accused her of bigotry. They called her work dangerous. This is a woman who's a lifelong liberal.
Well, I saw it, Lisa, and I have some questions.
And these children that you spit on as they try to change their world are immune to your consultations. They're quite aware what they're going through. Don't tell them to grow up out of it. Where's the shame you've left us up to our necks in it? Time may change me, but you can't trace time.
Now, I'm going to give Lisa some credit here. The Detransitioner paper is better than the original ROGD paper in one respect. It didn't base its entire methodology on asking parents what their teenagers were thinking, something which no parent of teenagers would ever be able to accurately do. This study doesn't do that. It actually asks the target group, detransitioners, what they think about their own lives. Congratulations.
You did a great job.
So proud of you.
You're very special.
Congratulations. I'm now going to take that credit away again and mock this research, because even though it doesn't make that rookie mistake, it would still get torn to pieces by a first-year undergrad who spent most of the year smoking weed and masturbating rather than attending stats class. Firstly, the sample. It's 100 people. 100. Now, those of you who have watched my other videos might be thinking, well, hey man, like you talked about before how, small sample sizes aren't always a bad thing, and detransition is rare, so, well, gentle viewer, this previous study by Turban et al., which I know she's read because she tries to refute it in the first paragraph, had a sample size of over 2,000 people. This is because Turban et al. Is an actual psychology research team and chose to access data from the vast nationwide 2015 US transgender survey. They didn't have to put out a public questionnaire on a bunch of Tumblr blogs because they're not hack gynecologists trying to get clout off the back of the latest trans panic. Yeah, and those Tumblr blogs where they got participants from, yeah, they were detransition blogs. While this isn't quite as bad as the previous study, pulling participants from literal hate sites like Transgender Trend, this does skew the data to quite a significant degree. If you were a detransitioner and had no regrets about your attempts to transition, that you're fine with who you are now, or you realise you were non-binary this whole time, whatever the reasoning, you're happy with what's happened. What would you get from looking at a detransitioner blog that's full of pain and regret? The only thing you would get is very sad, like, damn, I hope that person feels better about themselves someday. They might look at a few, but they aren't going to be frequent visitors of those blogs, because the world is full of enough depressing shit, and actively looking for more would be an act of digital self-harm. The people who follow these blogs close enough to catch Littman's call for participants are much more likely to be the kind of person who identifies and relates with that pain, skewing the sample of participants towards people who regret transitioning more than not. If the sample size was bigger than 100 blog followers, this might not be such an issue, but one person equaling 1% of the data makes the possibility for sampling bias that much bigger. While the sample is a big problem, it's not the only problem.
Oh, hell no!
It's very important when acquiring self-report data that the questions you ask are not, to coin a phrase, fucked up beyond all recognition. The ways in which the fucked or non-fucked status of a questionnaire is determined is complicated, but it revolves around the concept of validity. Does the question ask what we think it does, and does the answer tell us anything about what we're investigating? Internal validity testing is far too complex for me to explain here, but it's the reason a lot of studies pull from a common pool of questionnaires that have been thoroughly tested before, like the Beck Depression Scale, stuff like that. Littman, rather cheekily, uses the same multiple choice multiple answers method as Turban et al., probably so she can say the same thing as she did last time to defend her methods.
And all hell breaks loose. You're called a bigot. Lisa Littman, TERF. Let's get them.
A lot of people are using let's say a double standard. That's how I saw, there's this methodology, fine in this other study, but horrible in mine.
Right. Unless your name is Lisa Littman.
But instead of just using the same questionnaire, Littman instead elected to make her own, with blackjack and hookers. Oh, and a bunch of questions that she just made up out of thin air based on weird chaser pervert Ray Blanchard's debunked bullshit from the 1980s, and questions from fucking Tumblr blogs. More on that later. Some of the questions are fine enough, but unlike the Turban study, which had a broad swath of optional answers, divided pretty rationally into separate categories using simple language, Littman has fewer, vaguer, and less varied questions that hit on less points. You can learn a lot more from a study that asks what kind of discrimination people faced and from whom than a study that has one question item saying, did they do a discrimination? And while some of the questions are okay, I guess, I had erotic reasons for transitioning is that weird pervert Blanchard's thinking raising its ugly head again. Oh, and it was also the least picked option. The reason Littman did this is pretty obvious. She isn't looking to know as much as she can about the D-trans experience. She's looking to back up TERF talking points you see on hate sites with a stat that she can wave at other people and go, see, look at me, I have the information, do I deserve clout yet? That's why this list of questions reads like a Twitter screed by @xxwooms fuck your gender. Because that's what it is. And this whole study is a weak flailing attempt to back up those talking points. Once you realise what this study is, it becomes really hard to take anything it says seriously anymore. Not to say that there aren't other problems too, of course. The study spends a lot of time talking about social transition, despite specifically excluding people who never underwent HRT. Mostly. The questionnaire design itself, multiple choice with multiple answers, doesn't really tell us which of the answers was the primary reason for detransition. Having a study where you rank your factors in order of importance would be a lot better. But to be fair, this is a flaw with the Turban study too, because it drew data from an already existing survey. But you have fresh data, Lisa. Maybe look a little harder, you hack. And unlike the Turban study, at no point does this research paper note the very simple and obvious fact that detransition does not inherently mean regret. So this study is broken. Pretty badly, from the ground up. Again. The more you think about it, the more it falls apart, like a piece of paper in a washing machine. But follow me on a thought experiment, dear viewer. Even if it was made properly, even if it wasn't just a piece of scientific propaganda designed to justify taking away the rights of a marginalised group and possibly justify some kind of, I don't know, violence?
Close the door. How many kids are in here? How many kids are in here?
Even if it was made in good faith, this study would still not support the ROGD hypothesis. Why? Well, let's look at what they actually found. In the discussion section of this study, Littman writes this sentence. The data in this study strengthens, with first-hand accounts, the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis, which, briefly stated, are that psychosocial factors such as trauma, mental health conditions, maladaptive coping mechanisms, internalized homophobia, and social influence can cause or contribute to the development of gender dysphoria in some individuals. Okay, Professor, yeah, me at the back of the class. I have one small question. Does it? I mean, does it? Are you sure? The core ideas of ROGD are as follows. 1. Teenagers are able to be convinced that they have gender dysphoria and are trans. 2. This can be done via peer groups and social media or some kind of trauma. 3. these teenagers are not really trans. There's a bunch of other ideas swimming around the concept, but this is the assertion that Littman was making in the original study. So, mean age of participants is 21.9 at the beginning of medical transition. So the first word of the first assertion is already on shaky ground here. The decision to transition could have been made years earlier, sure, but these weren't teenagers. They were college-age adults making their own medical decisions, and the mean age for the detransitioners who were assigned male at birth was even higher at 26. Well, okay, just because they weren't necessarily teenagers doesn't mean they weren't convinced by outside forces, right? Well, according to themselves, only 35% think that they were convinced by someone else that they were trans. That's not very high. In fact, the number of people who still identify as trans or non-binary is 39% in this study. That's even higher. How many thought it was a trauma response then? 36%. Still not even close to a majority. But what about that vicious social media the kids are always on these days? Surely that must be 48% to 43%, depending on the website. Strangely, YouTube was reported highest, and I would argue that YouTube doesn't really encourage friend or peer groups to associate on them very much. It hosts videos, and the only interaction between viewers is screeching at each other in the comments. Not exactly a hotbed of positive social reinforcement, is it? But the peer groups were mocking people who weren't trans. Doesn't that have an influence? 22% had friends that mocked cis people. It's a social contagion, and as soon as one person in the friend group transes, they all... Only 36% had a trans friend. It's a trend, I say, a fad. They're doing it to be popular. 19% say they got more popular after transitioning, which means 81% stayed the same or went down. In the last sentence of this paragraph about the detransition results, a sentence which I imagine Lisa Littman was typing very slowly with teeth grinding so hard it could be heard in the cold vacuum of space, she finally gets bullied by her own data into admitting that the majority of respondents did not have those experiences. The ROGD idea that kids are being socially pressured into being trans falls apart when A, they aren't really kids, B, only a minority felt the change came from outside forces, and C, well, this isn't in the results of this study, but I felt a need to add it because it's been bugging me for a while. Society pressures you to be cis and straight. All the time. Like, all of it. There is no pattern of data in this study that supports ROGD being a valid phenomenon. There just isn't. No matter how much she claims otherwise in the discussion section, even this severely biased, poorly collected data debunks what she's been claiming. She's got literally less than nothing. Okay, so it doesn't support ROGD. What about all the other stuff her avid fans love to sling around? Well, while a slim majority of 56.7% thought that their mental health care was inadequate, and a whopping 2/3 say that they weren't asked if the gender dysphoria came from trauma, this could be pretty easily explained by 1. Mental health care systems are pretty much never adequate anywhere, as those of you who've been there can attest, and 2. Gender dysphoria and trauma are not causally linked. Just because they are correlated doesn't mean they are relevant to each other and should be addressed by the same therapist. So the woke doctor argument is kind of dead in the water with this one too. The internalized homophobia narrative? Ha! The quantitative part of this study doesn't even ask that. The narratives, or rather anecdotes section does. And I just want to say for the record, qualitative analysis is a real thing, yes. But just saying, one anonymous person said this is not analysis. It's a 4chan green text story. What about the detransition narrative itself? Well, you could argue that this marginally suggests that people detransition because they weren't really trans. It makes similarly strong arguments that people were. TERFs like to ignore non-binary people as a concept because they don't fit into the self-mutilating surgeries narrative. But even in this faux science disaster, which for some reason doesn't seem to think MB people are trans, I mean, they are. Plenty of people in this study landed up on non-binary as an identity, and yeah, cool. At first you thought you were in the binary, and then you discovered you were somewhere else. Nothing wrong with that. That's not really even detransition if you ask me. That's just getting off the train a station or two early because you changed where you wanted to go. You didn't de-train ride, right? Any detransition argument this study makes is completely obliterated by the much, much, much stronger, more relevant, better designed, and not done by a vagina doctor, Turban study I referenced earlier. With its GigaChad sample size of over 2,000 people, the Turban et al. Study found that 85% of detransitioners cited one or more external reasons that cause them to detransition in the first place, and only 15% cited one or more internal reasons. Nice and simple, clear difference, no doubt about it being significant. And if anyone watching this is worrying about all those detransitioners having genital surgery that they can't take back, while pretty much everyone in the study took HRT or puberty blockers at one point, the percentage of participants who had bottom surgery was 6%. As in, 6 people. This study doesn't just debunk itself, it debunks TERFism almost unilaterally. If it were a better made study, I could cite this in debates to support trans rights. But even though the data says pretty much the opposite of what the discussion section asserts, people will still treat this paper and its author seriously, and it's a useful piece of sciencey propaganda. People believe it anyway, because, well, look at it. It has graphs and tables, percentages and citations. Citations. Interesting, these citations look a little... Oh, no, you didn't.
Oh, now. Oh, boy, I'm gonna hurt you.
Yes, you saw that correctly. This totally legitimate research that isn't a propaganda piece for fascism cites YouTube videos. That is the literal opposite of what should be happening. YouTube videos should be citing studies and papers. Papers should not be citing videos made by random dumb fucks. Not even mine. But it gets worse than that. One of the YouTube videos cited is from this charming gentleman, Michael Tracy, a known anti-gender ideology shitposter who managed to convince people he was a leftist and a journalist when he's neither. Yes, that guy who spent 2020 fear-mongering over violent BLM anarchists spreading COVID, but thinks it's fine to show up on a college campus to shout against lockdown measures like he's anti-vax James Franco. Michael Tracy isn't a good source for his own thoughts on trans people, so forgive me if I find his scientific rigour a little questionable in this regard.
Fair to say that in not adhering to the dominant forms of trans ideology or activism right now, it necessarily means that you want to leave them out in the cold.
We can talk about your beliefs if you like. We don't have to dance around the hypothetical. Are trans women women?
Are trans women women? If that's how they identify, then I personally, from my own personal perspective, I'd be happy to honor their requests in terms of what they would like to be perceived as by society. Sure.
So you'd humor them?
I would humor them?
Yeah.
I don't know that I would put it that way. I mean, I would respect their wishes.
But would they be women?
A few minutes later.
To define your terms here.
So is Tulsi Gabbard a woman?
Is Tulsi Gabbard a woman? Yeah, I mean, she presents as a woman, sure.
Okay, wait. So you just answered with yes immediately. When I ask you if a trans woman is a woman, I hear 5 minutes of tap dancing.
In terms of your interactions with me, you're a woman. I don't really get the distinction.
So imagine if I ask you, do you think black people are people? And you say, well, I'll treat them like people. What do you think that would suggest about your opinions towards black people? It would be that they're kind of not people, right? That's what you're doing right now.
You'd think citing an obvious propagandist would be, the bottom right, but oh no, it gets worse than that. One of the sources listed here links to an article by Kate Herzog about detransition, an article even people interviewed for it now say is garbage, and whose only citation for detransition stats is another blog post by Blanchard-inspired and now disgraced sex researcher James Cantor, which cites cherry-picked studies from as far back as the 1970s, one of which is literally called the sissy boy syndrome, saying that most people who transitioned were actually cis by what? Just looking at the sample sizes and averaging them with no actual analysis at all? Oh, you fucking... This rabbit hole shit happens for pretty much every citation you click on. Not just in this paper, but in transphobic fake science everywhere. Everything they cite is just as flawed and bad faith as the people who cite them back. In researching the last video, I read a letter to the editor of PLOS ONE, supporting Lisa Littman's paper. The letter was full of bold statements about how prevalent detransition is and how many people regret transition, citing a case study. A study that focuses on one singular person, A study with a sample size of 1. At the time I thought this was quite funny, but not really relevant, so I left it out. It seems I missed the cursed forest for the spooky trees here, because this is apparently endemic in anti-trans science. There aren't enough studies to back up your assertions, the ones that exist are very small or laughably weak, so you get creative when it comes to what you use as evidence. Getting creative is exactly what Lisa's done here, citing weak data, articles in questionable blogs, random Tumblr pages that pretend to be science but aren't, and fucking Twitter accounts? Twitter. The place where context goes to die. Where discourse is eternally locked in a cycle of passive-aggressive mean girl bitching that never goes anywhere. Where people can literally make an entire fake persona just for a joke. Right, that's it. If this can get published, then science is over, guys. You had it, you fucked it, it's over. It's over, it's completely fucking... You do not cite tweets, the collective brain farts of humanity, in a real science paper. You just don't. I could go on Twitter right now and post a thread about how detransitions don't actually exist and they're all brainwashed clones made in a lab with aborted fetal tissue to try and discredit trans rights as a concept. I could do that. I won't, but I could. And all it would take is some Alex Jones-infected PhD student to cite that in his paper arguing for the banning of abortion, and suddenly it would get published in the archives of sexual behaviour, apparently. Honestly, the fact that this was published at all is a disgrace to the notion of peer review. But I do wonder how exactly the peers in question missed the fact that this study cites tweets on the first fucking page, in exactly the same format as it cites papers, to make scientific assertions. Putting the frankly heinous stupidity of the ASB aside though, the reason for this web of citation masturbation is obvious. It's the only way to keep up the illusion of good faith, the only way to scare otherwise apolitical liberals into believing their children and society are under attack from wokeness somehow. Much like the scientific racists and anti-vaxxers of the past, citing sources knowing that most people won't bother to read them is a masking technique. Dressing your previously held bigotry in a sciencey outfit both allows the already bigoted to feel smart and rational, while tricking new people, like journalists who don't read science, into bigoted circles by pretending you act in good faith and are just asking questions. It's a trick that the right-wing grifters of the intellectual dark web do masterfully, and it works. It's why people took Sam Harris seriously about Islam, Brett Weinstein seriously about ivermectin, and Jordan Peterson about, well, anything that he's ever said or published.
What rules, you sons of bitches? Exactly. Precisely.
It's frustrating to deal with all this, but it's necessary, I feel, to expose these propaganda merchants for what they are. They are not scientists, they are not journalists, they are not asking controversial questions, they are not being cancelled for speaking truth. They are all dangerous propagandists who make a hearty living from abusing confirmation bias in their audience. Some of them are actively transphobic right-wing pricks who want the world to conform to their way of thinking because they're breathtakingly insecure and dislike other people being happier than they are. Some of them are useful propaganda tools who allow their fears to drive negative behaviours and who haven't read enough history to understand the end results of their actions. Which one it is doesn't really matter to me, because we could never prove it conclusively if people like J.K. Rowling are acting in good faith. And whatever the intention is, the outcome is the same. The outcome may seem obvious at a first glance. It's transphobia, right? They want to suppress trans people, trans rights, trans youth, and any mention of trans people existing anywhere ever, right? Well, that's the obvious answer. And by itself, that would be bad enough for sure. But historically, the outcome of a society that allows itself to be clogged with scientific misinformation is far, far darker. Pseudoscience is nothing new. As far back as the Enlightenment, when religious arguments for keeping people suffering started looking a bit, well, wank, other reasons had to be found to justify the emotional reactions of conservatives to social change. Prejudice, as we know, is hard to shift when people have to rely on competition for resources to survive, and because that did not fundamentally change during the Enlightenment, religious reasons for fear of heathens became scientific reasons for fear of lesser races. And we got scientific racism out of it, that lingers to this very day. Lysenkoism, pseudoscientific Soviet genetics, arose due to the fear of Western bourgeoisie influence in the Soviet genetics field. And we got the Great Leap Forward out of it. Lysenkoism itself still lingers to this day in Russia. Gender-critical feminism arose in response to the fears that gender theory would somehow devalue the rights of women and give biological men access to their social category and spaces. And we got... well, look at the world right now. Red states in America are passing anti-trans laws left and right. The UK government very publicly went back on its promise to ban conversion therapy for trans people, and have done nothing to improve the shockingly long wait times for trans people to access care. Poland has nearly 100 anti-LGBT zones where LGBT people must conform, hide or risk violence. In 2020, Hungary banned legally changing your gender in any way. China recently banned men deemed too feminine from appearing on TV, and any film shown in China has the quote-unquote gay parts cut out. This is not me saying that the gender-critical movement is solely responsible for the recent upticks in discrimination. That would be giving them way too much credit, but they do play a critical role in convincing others to go along with it. When Jim Crow laws were passed in the United States, the justifications were cloaked in the language of scientific racism. When the Nuremberg laws were passed in 30s Germany, the justifications were cloaked in language of scientific racism. When Mao started the Great Leap Forward and caused the greatest famine of the 20th century, the justifications were cloaked in the language of Lysenkoism. The hierarchies in power in each of those examples wanted to pass laws that oppressed people for their own reasons. They dressed it up in pseudoscience to make it difficult for someone without a science degree to criticize it, and to encourage the belief that the powerful must have a point, right? I mean, look at all these graphs. Gender-critical ideas, even when they aren't being labelled as such by the people using them, are the cloak that will be used by governments to disguise discrimination and morally defend the indefensible. I mean, they've already started. We're not banning transgender teachers, we're preventing social contagion. We're not suppressing transgender athletes, we're ensuring fairness in women's sports. We're not saying trans people are dangerous, we're protecting women from penised individuals. None of these defences hold up to scrutiny or data, of course, but they don't really have to. All they have to do is muddy the waters just enough to prevent you from seeing what the shark is actually doing. To keep this insipid, already settled debate going long enough to convince uninformed observers with no stake in the matter, i.e. most people, thinking that the rights of their fellow human beings to live in dignity without fear are somehow something you can take sides on. Now, if you're a gender-critical person who's somehow made it this far into the video, well, firstly, well done for sticking it out. I've been quite mean to you, but you may be thinking something like this. How can this man compare my woman's movement to eugenics or Lysenkoism? Okay, they aren't exactly the same. The key difference is that TERF ideas haven't been adopted officially as state doctrine. Yet. The UK establishment, both media and state, is currently being pulled in both directions by inclusive queer rights groups like Stonewall and the gender-critical and right-wing movements like LGB Alliance, and a whole bunch of other ones I'm not going to list because I don't want to give them free promo. We don't know which side will win, but we do know that TERFism has a lot of money and the established media is largely on their side. In the US, several states in the South have already begun using GC language to instill increasingly harsh restrictions on trans people, but federally, it has not been taken up as policy. Yet. Will this escalate further? Is there going to be some kind of systemic violence against trans people? Sad to say, that's a trick question. It's already happening. Will we get from Tier 4 to Tier 5? Will the violence graduate from stochastic and systemic to industrial? I can't predict the future. All I can say is that every time in history we allowed a pseudoscience like scientific racism, eugenics, Lysenkoism, homeopathy, even astrology, to grow big enough to drive policy, people died.
What did he just say?
He said there's a storm coming in.
I know.
Queer, that there can be non-binary, poly, pan, it's all in there. And yes, I am in Brighton, from Brighton, and here's some songs that I wrote, so you can enjoy them now with me.
The right-wing elements of society, both offline and online, have been really running hard against the queer community as of late. Partly to radicalise their base for upcoming elections, but mostly because they have been building a narrative to justify their hatred for years. To the point where it's now out of control and has taken on a life of its own as part of the ever-growing grand web of conspiracy that plagues right-wing thought. It can be easy for those on my side of the fence to feel scorn for detransitioners, both for being a part of that narrative and in some cases for helping to advance it. But we don't judge anyone based on who they are. We don't really know who anyone is. We can only judge what they do and what the outcomes of those actions are. Detransition is not an immoral act, and judging the people who decide to do it by what other people say about it, it just wouldn't be right. Kai Shevers, an ex-detransitioner who was interviewed in one of those blog posts I mentioned earlier, and later denounced it, describes ideologically driven detransition as ideologically motivated detransition is conversion therapy. It teaches that trans people are unhealthy, inauthentic, and dysfunctional, and that transition is self-destructive and unsatisfying. It rejects modifying the body through medical transition, but attempts to change the mind in order to conform with the ideals of the ideology. It tries to convince trans people that our sense of self is false, that we can't have happy or satisfying lives as trans people. It's part of the backlash against trans rights, just as the ex-gay movement was a backlash against gay rights. And describes being intensely pressured by her fellow detransitioned women to continue trying to be a woman, despite the fact it didn't make her happy. In the detransitioned women's community, gender dysphoria is separated from trans identity and treated like a symptom to be managed, much like ex-gays draw a distinction between experiencing same-sex attraction and identifying as gay. We rejected the whole concept of gender identity. Living as a woman felt increasingly wrong, but I was terrified of giving up the life I had built as a detransitioned lesbian with a prominent role in the detrans women's community. After a certain point, it was all too much. Why did I have to work so hard to be a woman if that's what I really was? Why did it even matter so much what gender I felt like? Why expend so much time and energy trying to micromanage my thoughts and feelings, my very sense of self? People in the community acted as if they knew what I was and what my experience meant better than I did. There was an extra pressure on me because I was considered an influential voice in the community, and people were concerned that I could lead people astray if I said the wrong things. Staying on message was more important than being honest about my life. I no longer felt depressed or suicidal about transitioning. I was happy that my past was no longer causing me tremendous pain, but instead of being glad for me, other detrans women acted as if I was crazy and in denial. To me, it seemed like they liked me better when I was still in pain, that they cared more about painting medical transition as being harmful and destructive. People detransition for all kinds of reasons, and from what the good studies we have show, most of those reasons are external, i.e. things we can address by making society more accepting. And all of those reasons are really nobody's business but your own. Transitioning can be a long, expensive process requiring a lot of introspection and a lot of often unwanted input from others. It's no wonder some people decide not to walk that path in a straight line. And from a scientific perspective, that path is also none of your business, TERF. While the very existence of detransitioners has been used by the anti-LGBT movement as a stick to beat people with, there is nothing wrong with being a detransitioned person. It's the bigots narrativizing their existence that need to be stopped, for the good of all of us. And to do that will require us to reach out our hands in solidarity, not aggression. No matter who you are, gay or straight, cis, trans or detrans, your story, your identity, is ultimately just that, yours. It's not a dangerous contagion that could be passed socially, because it was never created by society in the first place. Your identity was constructed by you, your memories, your perceptions, your stories, your emotions. Can society affect those things? Sure, but never be convinced that your sense of self was put there by somebody else. We are all stories told by unreliable narrators, us. Doubt is to be expected, but if you want to be happy and at peace with yourself, don't listen to the people who think you should be broken. Celebrate yourself when you feel whole, which to me is what being LGBT is all about. There are big forces in the world right now who want to make life difficult or even impossible for queer people of every stripe, in every nation. Fake science is the cover they'll use, but their cover is a paper tiger, so don't be afraid to tear it to shreds as loudly and publicly as you can. They'll scream that you're a science denier or irrational or delusional, but you're not. Believe me, they haven't read their fake studies any more than you have. And a quick glance will likely be all you need to mock them in your own 45-minute YouTube video. Don't be afraid to call out pseudoscience, because until people call the snake oil salesman's bluff, people are going to keep buying the snake oil. There's a storm coming for all of us right now. Inflation, cost of living crises, an increasingly hostile climate, and for queer people, it's laws, handcrafted to keep you silent and force you to bend to the will of the majority. Never forget though, we've been here before, and we won. What Stonewall proved all those years ago is that we won't get the equality we deserve by being quiet. Silence and apathy is death when the forces around the world seek to take away our rights one by one. And no one can deny the wind is blowing in that direction. The moment always arrives when inaction is no longer a choice available to you. So think of all the queer people who've touched your life, helped you find yourself, heard you out when you needed it, and been there to catch you when everything was falling apart. And if you feel too small, too powerless, too afraid to stand up for yourself, trust me, you will find the strength to stand up for each other.